Berlin, July 1948. The air above Tempelhof Airport trembles with the low, rhythmic thunder of propellers. A C-47 Dakota descends through the haze of coal dust and exhaust, its silver fuselage flashing in the midday sun. Below, crowds of Berliners, thin, hollow-eyed but defiant, crane their necks skyward. Children clutch buckets and empty tins, waiting for what they call raisin bombers. As the aircraft touches down, its tires screech across the cracked concrete. Mechanics sprint forward before the engine stops spinning. Within minutes, sacks of flour, powdered milk, coal, and medicine are heaved out onto waiting trucks. The pilots barely have time for a sip of coffee before takeoff. Another aircraft is already on final approach. Another behind that. A line of planes stretching across the western horizon. From a distance, the scene looks almost mechanical. An unbroken stream of motion, precision, and resolve. But to Soviet commanders watching from their control posts, it is something else entirely, an impossibility. For weeks, Moscow had believed the blockade of Berlin, their chokehold on all roads, rails, and rivers, would force the Western powers to retreat. No supplies by land, no fuel, no food. The city, they thought, would fall quietly, starved into submission. But the Americans, the British, and a handful of French crews had answered with something unexpected, a logistical miracle born from desperation. Cargo planes flying around the clock every 3 minutes for a city of 2 million trapped behind enemy lines. At Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst, disbelief turned to anger. Reports poured in. The airlift continues despite weather, despite shortages, and despite exhaustion. By all rational calculations, it should have failed within days. It was, by Soviet logic, unsustainable. Fuel would run out, morale would crumble, machinery would break. Yet each dawn brought new flights, new records, new defiance. And somewhere in the noise of that endless chain of engines, the shape of the post-war world was changing. The air over Berlin had become the new front line, not of bullets or bombs, but of endurance and ideology. As the camera of history pulls back, we see it clearly. Rows of Allied aircraft slicing through the gray sky, rising from bases in West Germany, threading the narrow air corridors through Soviet-controlled territory, landing in a besieged city that refused to die. It wasn't supposed to work. It wasn't supposed to last. But the Berlin Airlift had just begun, and it would not stop. What the world witnessed in the skies above Berlin in 1948 was not merely a relief effort. It was the opening act of the Cold War, played out in the language of tonnage, endurance, and aviation engineering. At its heart, the Berlin Airlift was a confrontation over a single idea: who would control the fate of post-war Europe? The Soviet Union had expected Berlin, surrounded deep inside their occupation zone, to fall quietly into their orbit. It was logical. The city's western sectors were starved of fuel, food, and power. The Western Allies were isolated thousands of kilometers from home and depended on narrow supply routes through Soviet-controlled Germany. The Kremlin believed time was on their side. But to Washington, London, and Paris, the stakes were not just about one city. They were about credibility. If the Western powers abandoned Berlin, it would signal to all of Europe that Soviet pressure worked. Democracy, still fragile after the ruins of fascism, would be seen as weak. Inside the White House, President Harry S. Truman faced an impossible choice: confront the blockade with force and risk open war, or withdraw and concede Berlin. Truman chose a third path, one no general had proposed: to fly over the blockade. It was a move of both desperation and genius. The Allies already had air rights, 3 narrow corridors agreed upon after Germany's surrender. The Soviets could not legally shoot down aircraft without declaring war. Truman's message was simple: we stay in Berlin, period. Behind that decision stood men like General Lucius D. Clay, the U.S. military governor in Germany, who warned, if we withdraw, our position in Europe is lost. Clay understood that Berlin had become a symbol, the testing ground for the world order that would define the second half of the 20th century. And so the air bridge began not as an act of mercy, but as a statement of will. It was a logistical weapon, forged in peacetime but powered by wartime determination. Each cargo drop was not only a delivery of supplies, but a defiance of Soviet intent. For the Soviet High Command, this response was baffling. They had studied American military doctrine, expected aggression or retreat, not an industrial ballet of planes defying weather, fatigue, and physics itself. The airlift was not supposed to be a viable solution. Yet day after day, it kept Berlin alive. Hidden beneath the roar of engines was a quiet revelation. Power in the new world would not always come from the barrel of a gun, but from the endurance of a supply chain. The story of the Berlin Airlift began not in the summer of 1948, but in the ruins of May 1945, when Nazi Germany surrendered and Europe lay shattered. Berlin, once the proud capital of a totalitarian empire, was now a skeletal ruin, half rubble, half ghost town. The Allies divided the city into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. At first, cooperation seemed possible. The Allies had fought shoulder to shoulder to defeat Hitler. At the Potsdam Conference that July, U.S. President Harry Truman, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin agreed that Germany would be jointly administered, denazified, and rebuilt. Yet beneath the formalities, distrust was already forming. The Soviets, having suffered over 27 million casualties, viewed Germany as both a threat and a source of reparations. They stripped their zone of factories, machinery, and rail lines, shipping the spoils eastward to rebuild their own devastated homeland. The Western Allies, meanwhile, sought economic recovery, not punishment. To them, a revived Germany was essential to Europe's stability. This clash of visions hardened into something deeper, a divide between 2 incompatible systems. In 1947, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, offering billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe. The Soviets saw it as an imperial bribe, an attempt to pull the continent into Washington's economic orbit. Stalin responded by tightening control over Eastern Europe, installing loyal communist regimes from Warsaw to Prague. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill had famously called it, was no longer a metaphor. It was policy. Berlin, located 160 kilometers inside the Soviet zone, became a geopolitical anomaly, a western island surrounded by communism. Its western sectors, home to around 2.2 million people, were linked to the outside world only by thin lifelines, a handful of highways, rail lines, and air corridors. As the Western powers began integrating their zones economically, forming what would soon become West Germany, Stalin grew alarmed. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, to stabilize the economy. Overnight, the Soviet sector's old Reichsmarks became worthless. The Kremlin saw the move as an act of provocation, the first step toward a divided Germany. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces cut all ground access to Berlin. Trains were stopped, canals closed, roads blocked by armed guards. Trucks carrying coal and food were turned back. Electricity from Soviet power stations was severed. Berlin was to be starved into submission. For Stalin, it was a masterstroke, bloodless but absolute. No shots fired, yet the Western Allies were cornered. To withdraw would mean abandoning millions of civilians and conceding the moral high ground of post-war Europe. What Stalin underestimated was the psychological weight of that moral choice. For the men sitting in command posts in Frankfurt and Washington, Berlin was more than a city. It was a symbol of freedom under siege, a test of whether words like liberation and democracy could survive when surrounded by barbed wire and fear. The blockade had begun, and with it, the first real confrontation of the Cold War. To understand the magnitude of the Berlin Airlift, one must grasp what it actually took to keep a city alive through air alone. Every loaf of bread, every drop of fuel, every handful of coal, all had to be flown over hostile territory through a sky divided by ideology. When the Soviets sealed off Berlin's ground routes in June 1948, the western sectors required at least 4,500 tons of supplies per day just to survive. In the dead of winter, That figure would climb past 6,000 tons. No Air Force on Earth had ever attempted such an operation. The task fell to Operation Vittles, the U.S. Air Force's code name for the airlift, and Operation Plainfare, its British counterpart. The concept was deceptively simple. Use the 3 legal air corridors into Berlin, from Hamburg, Hanover, and Frankfurt, to fly in continuous waves of cargo planes. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. Airfields at Tempelhof, American sector, and Gottow, British sector, became the beating hearts of the operation. Each hour was choreographed with near military precision. Landings were scheduled at 3-minute intervals, 24 hours a day. Any pilot who missed a slot by more than 30 seconds risked collision. There were no holding patterns. If you couldn't land on time, you turned back. The first aircraft were humble C-47 Dakotas, relics of World War II that could carry only 3 tons of cargo. Soon, heavier C-54 Skymasters joined the effort, capable of hauling 10 tons each. Pilots began calling the route the Berlin Corridor, and for good reason. It was narrow, turbulent, and always at risk of Soviet harassment. Fighters would occasionally shadow the cargo planes or release weather balloons to test their nerve. Inside Tempelhof, ground crews moved like clockwork. A plane could land, unload, and take off again within 30 minutes. Coal was packed into burlap sacks small enough for a single man to carry, allowing faster offloading. Flour, fuel drums, and salt followed a strict weight-to-space ratio. Even the flight patterns were optimized. Planes took one corridor in, looped over the city, and exited through another, creating a continuous aerial circuit, a conveyor belt in the sky. Soon the operation began to scale beyond anyone's expectations. By August 1948, the Allies were flying 1,500 flights per day. By the following spring, that number would double. New airfields were constructed, Tegel Airport, built in just 90 days by French engineers, and thousands of Berliners rose from the rubble to handle the growing traffic. Behind the statistics was a culture of ingenuity. Pilots nicknamed the airlift the most boring war in history, yet it was also one of the most dangerous. Fog, ice, and exhaustion claimed lives. Crashes were frequent. Wreckage sometimes burned for hours on the edge of runways. Still, they flew. Each successful landing became an act of quiet resistance. To maintain morale, an American pilot named Gail Halverson began secretly dropping candy attached to handkerchief parachutes for Berlin's children. They called him Uncle Wiggly Wings, and soon other pilots followed suit. The gesture carried no military value, but its symbolism was immense. It told Berliners they had not been forgotten. By late 1948, the airlift was no longer just a supply operation. It was a system, one that defied Soviet predictions, military precedent, and even basic economics. The Allies had turned the sky into an artery of survival, a network so efficient that the city below could breathe again. And as tons of coal and flour crossed into the besieged sectors, something else traveled with them: belief. The belief that logistics, when powered by purpose, could stand against empire. By autumn 1948, the Berlin Airlift had become more than a lifeline. It was a war without gunfire. The Soviet Union and the Western Allies were locked in a battle of endurance and ideology, fought through pressure, propaganda, and precision scheduling. To the Soviet command, the operation was a humiliation unfolding in plain sight. They had expected fatigue to crush it within weeks. Instead, the tonnage was rising. The skies over East Germany buzzed with the constant drone of Western aircraft. Each landing at Tempelhof was a declaration that Stalin's blockade could not break Berlin's spirit. Inside the Kremlin, patience thinned. Reports from General Vasily Sokolovsky, the Soviet military governor, described an infuriating paradox. They are not starving, they are organizing. Stalin's strategy had rested on a simple calculation that the West's logistical backbone would collapse under strain. But in Washington and London, the opposite was happening. The airlift was evolving into a disciplined system, one that turned improvisation into engineering. Still, not all was harmony on the Allied side. The operation's success depended on flawless coordination between American, British, and French sectors, yet each had different command structures and priorities. British Air Commodore Reginald Waite one of the first to suggest an air supply effort, often clashed with American planners over fuel priorities and scheduling. General William H. Tunner, who had previously managed the Himalaya hump flights in World War II, demanded absolute precision. There will be no heroes, only routines. Tunner's methods were ruthless but necessary. He banned sightseeing over Berlin, outlawed risky maneuvers, and instituted assembly line discipline. Every pilot, every mechanic, every forklift driver followed the same clock. Efficiency became doctrine. The enemy is not the Soviets, Tunner told his crews. It's weather, fog, and fatigue. And the Soviets did their part to make those enemies worse. On foggy days, radar interference mysteriously increased. Soviet fighters performed mock attacks near the corridors. Weather balloons and flares were released in flight paths to intimidate Allied pilots. East German newspapers called the airlift an imperialist circus, claiming the West was wasting resources to feed capitalist parasites. But on the ground, Berliners saw something different. They saw young pilots risking their lives so that children could eat. They saw British crews hauling coal through sleet and rain. They saw unity, something rare in a divided world. The irony deepened. Stalin's blockade, meant to force Western withdrawal, was instead binding the Allies together. Political divisions that had once strained Washington and London were softening. Even the French, initially skeptical of the American-dominated plan, became active participants. Western Europe began to see the airlift as a symbol of shared survival, and more quietly, a warning that Soviet expansion had limits. By December 1948, the contrast was unmistakable. On one side, the Soviet machine, powerful, silent, but static, waiting for the city to fall. On the other, an improvised coalition of democracies, noisy and imperfect, yet in motion. The confrontation had revealed something Stalin's generals struggled to accept, that discipline alone cannot outlast determination. In the frozen runways of Berlin, the balance of moral power had shifted. And for the first time since the war's end, the West had found its footing, not in domination, but in defiance. The Berlin Airlift was not a single, steady success story. It was a battle fought in hours and inches, through fog, ice, exhaustion, and human error. Every ton of coal carried into the city carried the weight of 100 risks. The first major test came in the winter of 1948-49. Berlin froze. Temperatures plunged to 23 sort, and with the city's power grid severed by the blockade, heating became a daily struggle for survival. Every ounce of coal flown in mattered. The airfields themselves became battlefields of logistics, of weather, and of will. At Tempelhof, snow turned runways into ice sheets. Mechanics worked through the night with shovels and brooms, their breath freezing to their faces. Aircraft engines seized. Men collapsed from exhaustion. The airlift demanded 24-hour operations, yet the machinery of survival was literally freezing solid. On November 22, 1948, a U.S. Air Force C-54 Skymaster skidded off the runway after an engine flameout. The plane burst into flames, killing its crew and halting operations for hours. It wasn't the first crash, and it wouldn't be the last. By the end of the airlift, over 70 pilots and crew members from the U.S. and U.K. would lose their lives. But even tragedy became a lesson. General William Tunner, whose precision had turned chaos into rhythm, responded not with mourning speeches but with a new doctrine. Every accident is an instruction manual. He ordered stricter schedules, new approach lighting, and radar beacons to guide pilots through fog. The stack system was introduced, a continuous loop where planes circled at different altitudes, landing in order without ever idling. Within weeks, average unloading time fell below 10 minutes per plane. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything, Operation Santa Claus. In December 1948, the Allied command decided to fly in Christmas gifts donated by American families, candy, toys, clothes, alongside food supplies. The sight of packages parachuting into a gray, starving city gave Berliners something that tonnage alone couldn't deliver: hope. For Soviet observers, it was an infuriating spectacle, Western propaganda, they said. But for Berliners, it was a message written in the sky: you are not alone. Meanwhile, Tegel Airport in the French sector became the symbol of defiance through labor. Built in just 90 days by more than 19,000 Berliners, including many women, it was a triumph of civilian engineering. The Soviets had placed a radio tower directly in the flight path, a not-so-subtle act of obstruction. The French simply tore it down. The first aircraft landed on Tegel's gravel runway on November 5, 1948, expanding the airlift's capacity dramatically. By spring 1949, the airlift reached its climax. Tunner called it the airlift's D-Day. On April 16, 1949, in a single day, 1,298 flights delivered 12,941 tons of supplies, a record tonnage surpassing what could have been transported by rail before the blockade. For the first time, air had outperformed land. The Soviets, once confident that the blockade would bring the Allies to their knees, were now forced to confront the unthinkable. Their strategy had failed. The blockade, intended to divide, had unified the West. It had created operational systems and alliances that would soon form the foundation of NATO. But at ground level, the victory was quieter and more human. In kitchens across West Berlin, families boiled potatoes made from American flour. Streetlights flickered to life, powered by coal flown in from Frankfurt. And children ran toward Tempelhof, waving to the sky each time a plane descended. Every roar of an engine had become the sound of freedom. As one Berlin newspaper wrote in April 1949, "The planes do not bring us food alone. They bring us the proof that humanity has not ended." By the time Stalin lifted the blockade on May 12, 1949, the Allies had flown over 277,000 missions, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies. The airlift had not only saved Berlin, it had proven that resolve could be measured not in divisions or tanks, but in flights per day. The battle for Berlin was over, but the war of systems, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus control, had only just begun. When the Berlin Airlift finally broke the blockade in May 1949, the world hailed it as a triumph of freedom over tyranny. But beneath that victory lay layers of irony that reshaped the 20th century. Joseph Stalin had sought to secure Germany, to push the Western Allies out of Berlin, and to expand Soviet influence deeper into Central Europe. Instead, his blockade accomplished the opposite. It cemented the division of Germany, gave birth to NATO, and turned Berlin, the heart of a ruined Reich, into the beating symbol of resistance against communism. The Soviets, in trying to isolate the city, had inadvertently united the West. American, British, and French coordination, previously strained by mistrust and differing post-war agendas, was now ironclad. Command structures forged in the airlift became the foundation for NATO's future logistics. Western Europe, which had been drifting in uncertainty, now had a common cause and a common adversary. Even within Berlin, the blockade had produced paradoxical results. The Soviet sector, which included East Berlin, was meant to appear stable and prosperous under communist reconstruction. Yet, as food and coal rained down from Allied planes into the western half of the city, Berliners saw a visible contrast between systems, between abundance and control, openness and oppression. Propaganda could no longer hide the difference. Western newspapers printed photos of smiling Berlin children waving to American pilots, while Eastern outlets tried to frame the operation as capitalist showmanship. But the images spoke for themselves. The West was feeding the hungry, while the East was enforcing a siege. Stalin's attempt to prove the fragility of Western resolve had instead demonstrated its moral strength. And perhaps the deepest irony of all, the airlift, a peaceful operation, achieved more strategic gain than any military offensive could have. No bombs fell, no armies advanced, yet entire alliances were forged, borders hardened, and hearts won. When the Soviets lifted the blockade, they did so quietly without ceremony. There was no declaration, no victory parade. It was an implicit admission that brute power had failed to outlast persistence. Stalin, who had once claimed that ideas are more powerful than guns, had now been outmatched by an idea that endurance, unity, and principle could sustain a city under siege. But Berlin's salvation came at a cost. The airlift confirmed what the world now understood, that the Cold War was permanent. Germany would remain divided, east from west, ideology from ideology. The Iron Curtain was no longer just a metaphor. It was a border traced in the sky and solidified on the ground. The blockade ended, but the wall between systems had begun to rise, invisible yet unbreakable, for now. More than 7 decades after the last Raisin bomber touched down at Tempelhof, the Berlin Airlift still echoes through the strategies and moral vocabulary of modern geopolitics. It marked the moment when the West learned that power could be projected not just through armies, but through air corridors, logistics, and willpower. Its legacy lives on in every humanitarian mission, disaster response, and relief effort that has followed. When NATO aircraft dropped food and medicine over Sarajevo in the 1990s, when the United Nations airdropped aid into South Sudan, or when U.S. cargo planes delivered supplies to Ukraine under missile threat, each was a faint reflection of the airlift's lesson, that endurance and logistics can be as decisive as weapons. Military planners still study Operation Vittles as a model of efficiency. It was the first large-scale test of strategic air mobility, proving that air logistics could sustain not just a garrison, but a metropolis. The U.S. Air Force would later build its entire post-war doctrine on this insight, a doctrine that made global reach a substitute for territorial control. From Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, the principle remained: control the sky, and you can feed or fight anywhere on Earth. But the Berlin Airlift's legacy wasn't purely technical. It was moral and symbolic. It showed that an act of compassion could be geopolitically potent. As General Lucius D. Clay reflected years later, what the world remembered was not the tonnage, but the spirit. We showed that freedom could fly. In today's age of blockades and economic sanctions, the same questions still linger. How do you feed the besieged without igniting war? How do you stand firm against coercion without collapsing into violence? From Taiwan's air defense zones to humanitarian corridors in Gaza or Yemen, the dilemmas of Berlin remain alive, just dressed in new geography and technology. Even the city itself carries the memory. Tempelhof Airport, decommissioned in 2008, has become a vast public park, a place where Berliners jog, picnic, and fly kites on the same runways where C-54 Skymasters once landed with coal. In 2015, during the Syrian refugee crisis, the hangars that once held flour and fuel were filled again, this time with mattresses and blankets for displaced families. The echoes of 1948-49 could still be heard in the hum of humanitarian logistics. Perhaps most remarkably, the airlift's quiet triumph reshaped global perception of America and its allies. At a time when war-fatigued Europeans doubted whether democracy could protect them, the operation restored faith. The image of Allied planes flying into a gray, hungry Berlin became propaganda of a different kind. Not one of domination, but of endurance and mercy. The Soviet Union may have learned a strategic lesson of its own. For the next 40 years, it would rarely challenge Western supply chains directly. It would instead focus on ideology, espionage, and proxy conflicts, battles fought in the shadows, not the skies. The blockade had shown that material power could not always outlast moral resolve. The Berlin Airlift's legacy is therefore dual. It was both the first battle of the Cold War and the first great victory of peace through logistics. Its spirit persists every time nations choose to lift rather than bomb, to supply rather than siege. In the long chronicle of the 20th century, a century written in wars, revolutions, and ruins, the Berlin Airlift stands apart as an act of creation rather than destruction. It began as a desperate improvisation, a logistical footnote in the shadow of Stalin's ambitions. Yet by the time it ended, it had become one of the purest demonstrations of endurance in human history. Thousands of flights, millions of tons, a city kept alive by faith in motion. For those who lived beneath its roaring skies, it was not about ideology or strategy. It was the sound of salvation, the rhythm of propellers cutting through hunger and fear. Each aircraft that descended through the Berlin haze carried not just food or fuel, but proof that compassion could be engineered, measured, and repeated until it triumphed. The airlift turned the laws of warfare inside out. Where Blockade sought to starve, it delivered. Where empires imposed silence, it answered with the hum of engines. The battlefield became a runway, the weapon persistence. And in that inversion lay a deeper revelation, that survival sustained by will alone could defeat oppression without a single shot fired. In the years that followed, the world would fracture along familiar lines. Walls would rise, missiles would glint on launch pads, ideologies would clash in jungles, deserts, and proxy wars. Yet the memory of Berlin, that city lifted from the brink by air, lingered like a promise that endurance could outlast aggression. The men who flew those missions never called themselves heroes. They were engineers, navigators, loadmasters, ordinary people performing extraordinary repetition. "We just kept flying," one pilot recalled. "When the engines stopped, the city would die, so we didn't let them stop." And that is perhaps the true essence of the Berlin Airlift. Not the numbers or the geopolitics, but the continuity, the refusal to stop, the belief that motion itself could be a moral force. In a world where power so often manifests through domination, the airlift offered a different image, planes descending into a city of rubble, not to conquer it, but to sustain it. It was the first modern act of humanitarian defiance, an operation that proved logistics could be an instrument of conscience. When Stalin finally lifted the blockade, he did so in silence. The Allies did not celebrate with parades or gunfire. They simply kept flying until they were sure Berlin could stand. Then, quietly, they stopped, leaving behind a legacy measured not in territory gained, but in lives preserved. The last flight of the Berlin Airlift left Tempelhof on September 30th, 1949. As its engines faded into the dawn, Berliners gathered on rooftops, waving at the retreating silhouette. They had survived the blockade, and in doing so, they had defined the first moral victory of the Cold War. In the decades that followed, walls would rise again and fall. But the air above Berlin, once a corridor of defiance, would remain open. And somewhere in that endless sky, between the roar of history and the silence of peace, the lesson endures. That freedom, when sustained by courage and compassion, can fly.